Hi, this is Chris Seaman, and this is a post discussion recording of the second episode of Entire Bible. We tried to live stream. I had a technical difficulty again, and so I was not able to do it. But here we have the synopsis of what was talked about. So let's do a screen share with our handout. Okay, here's our handout. So in our first week, our first episode, we looked at the first of the two creation stories in the book of Genesis. So this is literally where the library of the Bible begins, the book of Genesis, and it has not one but two creation stories. I mentioned this last time, but now when we look at the second creation story, we'll really see the importance of recognizing this fact that there is not one but two creation stories. And the first thing to note about them is that they are neither sequential, in other words, one doesn't happen after the other in narrative time, nor are they narratively compatible. You can't make them mesh with one another. It's just not the sort of thing they are. And what I've done here is provide you a little, table to show you this. So, for example, in the first creation story, God creates vegetation in chapter 1, verse 11. But in chapter 2, verse 5, no vegetation exists. So where did it all go? Right? The point is that he hasn't created it yet. This is a different story. Similarly, humans are created in chapter 1, verse 26 to 27, but in chapter 2, verse 6, no human exists. So again, unless we're talking about a multiverse with two separate realities, these are rather two non-sequential accounts of the same reality, right? This includes not just repeating the same events, but also putting them in a different sequence. So, for example, in chapter 1, verses 20 to 25, God creates animals before he creates humans. But in chapter 2, verses 18 to 20, no animals exist and they are created after the human. Uh, Most important for grappling with the nature of these stories, as we know, in the first creation story, humans are created godlike. They are created in the image and likeness of God, and thereby they are distinguished from all other creatures. In the second creation story, human beings are not created godlike. They are created the same way as every other creature will be created later in the story. They are not godlike, but by the end of the story, they become godlike, but not through their created nature, through, in fact, a deviation from their created nature. So we end up in the same place. We're talking about the same reality at the end of both of these stories, but it has been explained in two entirely different ways. A good example of this is the final contrast. In the first creation story, in chapter 1, verse 28, the function of human beings is to populate and subdue the whole world. And yet, in the second creation story, they're created to work in a garden, a very small piece of real estate. Now, by the end of the story, they are expelled from the garden and therefore are forced to populate the whole earth. So again, we end up in the same descriptive reality, but its explanation is entirely different. Okay, so that's the first point. You can't put them, they are not sequential. The events of the second creation story do not happen after the events of the first, nor are they narratively compatible. You can't be created like God and not be created like God, right? Animals can't be created before humans and then again after humans, right? So forget that approach. Instead, we have to reckon with the fact, this second point, that these stories, different as they are, were deliberately set side by side, right? They came from two entirely different sources of tradition, but someone, an editor, a committee, a scribe, whatever we want to envision here, said we're going to put them right next to each other. We're not going to privilege one over the other. We're not going to affirm one and reject the other. We're going to put them side by side so that in the act of reading, the reader will be forced to contemplate several paradoxes of the world and of human nature. And we will study what those are in this episode. Okay, so I go through this as before, verse by verse. We won't always do this, but we have to do it for these stories because every word matters for grasping what the story is saying. So we begin with this editorial bridge. This line is not part of the first story or the second story. It is literally the way that the editor is sewing them together, where the editor says, "This is the genealogy of the heavens and the earth when they were created." This is the genealogy. Literally, it says these are the descendants. That's what genealogy, toladoth, means in Hebrew, which is kind of bizarre because in what sense can the heavens and the earth have descendants? It's obviously being used in some sort of metaphorical way, but what is this referring to? When it says this, is this referring to what has just been narrated in the first creation story or what's about to be narrated, or both? Well, there's definitely a callback to the first story because remember, the first story began in Hebrew, Barishit bara, when God began creating. Notice that this statement, this editorial statement, concludes with the statement Bahibaraam, when they were created. Now, in English, those sound different, but look at how they look at in Hebrew. They have exactly the same consonants and vowels in the same order. I mean, they're different words, but they're meant again to create a sound effect. Okay, so I think I've heard that sound before. Okay, so we're capturing within our thought everything that has gone before, beginning with Genesis 1:1. But then descendants means looking forward, right? So we're also looking forward. So this is evidence of intentionality on the part of the editor. They know that these are two different stories, and they want to have us think about them together. Okay, so here's the beginning of creation story number 2. And it says, "On the day that Yahweh God made earth and heavens." Okay, well, this is a rather new development. First of all, notice that in this creation story, everything happens on one day. There's no scheme of 7 days. Now, the expression bayom could mean just at the time when, but in any case, it's not using the term day in the way we've seen it that in the first story, where it's kind of structurally related to the sequence and order of things. This story is not concerned with sequence, right? Also, notice that the heavens and the earth have become earth and heavens. They've been switched in the order, and there's no definite article in front of them. This is just a different style of this story. Most interestingly, though, God has acquired a personal name, Yahweh. So literally, it says, "On the day that Yahweh Elohim made earth and heavens." So this is what's called the divine name, or in Greek, the tetragrammaton, which literally means the four-letter word, which is kind of funny because we use the term four-letter word for, harsh language. But in any case, um, what I've done here is simply provided you with the consonants without vowels, because the Hebrew language, in fact, does not have vowels. It has consonants, and the person who is reading a text has to vocalize them, has to supply the vowels. And if it's a conventional expression, there's no question about what the vowels would be. But of course, there are, as you can imagine, some words where if you only see the consonants, the vowels could be anything pretty much, and how you vocalize it could lead to a different interpretation. But in this case, we're pretty sure what it sounds like. So here's a couple of notes on this name. This combination, Yahweh God, which is as awkward in English as it sounds in Hebrew, appears only in this creation story, chapter 2, verse 4 to chapter 3, verse 24. Very likely, this story originally just had the personal name Yahweh, and our editor added Elohim after that in order to make sure that the reader understands that the two stories, the one about Elohim and the one about Yahweh, are, first of all, the same God, and that they are to be read together. So this is really an artificial construct, Yahweh God. Okay, well, how do we get this particular vocalization? Um, Modern scholars reconstruct the vocalizing of Yahweh, first of all, on the basis of the fact that most Hebrew names, personal names, have this element in them, Yah or Yahu. That's the first part of this, the YH. For example, Elijah or Eliyahu means Yah is my God. Also, the suffix that particular vowel is common for words that have these consonants. So Yahuwah, Yahweh. Right? Also, this is supported by ancient Greek transcription. So in ancient Greek texts, sometimes the divine name will be vocalized, and it'll be vocalized like this as Yahweh or Yahweh. And so that is evidence that this is, in fact, the accurate transcription. Now, why do most Bibles not give you, spell out Yahweh, the divine name? Well, partly by tradition. By the 3rd century BC, Jews avoided vocalizing Yahweh and substituted the title Adonai, my Lord. So when Jews read the text, instead of saying Yahweh, they'll say Adonai, even though that's not what it says. It's a way of reverentially avoiding the divine name. Just like in the, Lord is a title, right? It's a reverential title. So just like if you were going to, be presented before the Queen of England, you would say Your Majesty rather than saying whatever her name was. So that is a way of reverencing the divine name by not pronouncing it. When you got the printing press in the 16th century, Christian Bibles either masked Yahweh as the Lord, which followed the ancient Greek translation of the Bible that simply put Ho Kyrios, the Lord, wherever the divine name was, or Christian Bibles would combine the Hebrew consonants YHWH with the vowels for Adonai. So you get the hybrid word Jehovah, which has no basis in history, but it's a solution to how you reverence the name and yet still recognize that it has its own form, right? And that's where we get Jehovah from. It's basically Yahuwah, right? Okay, so that's just a little footnote. But it bears consideration. So how is God presented in this story? So he has a name like Fred or Bob, but does this name go with any kind of personality traits, for example, that we didn't see with God in Genesis 1? Just as we'll see, this creation story has a different way of imaging human nature. It has a different way of imaging God. Okay, so like the first creation story, which begins by telling you what was not there before the creative process begins, so too here we are told um, when wild plants of the field were not yet on the earth, when grasses of the field had not yet grown, so no vegetation. Why was there no vegetation? For Yahweh God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no human to work the soil. Okay, so here the problem is not chaos and cosmic order, it's the more quotidian one of the lack of the conditions for what we would call rainfall agriculture. How do I know that? Well, if you look later on in the story where grasses are mentioned, um, at the end of the story, the human being has to eat grasses and eat bread. Okay, well, where does bread come from? It comes from grain. So here, grasses means sort of grain producing plants. And so if you have no grain, no rain, and no soil worker, you have no rainfall agriculture. So that is, in a sense, the sociological metaphor that is being used here to describe the origin of human beings and their nature and purpose. Okay. Also, there's a word play here. So as we know, the Hebrew for human is Adam. And we have a word play because if there was no human to work the soil, the word for soil is Adamah. So there was no Adam to work the Adamah. Okay, so this becomes sort of the cluing the reader in that the story will not be complete until the soil has someone to work it, right? We're also told that there is a river that flows from the earth, that sort of wells up from the earth and waters the surface of the soil, even though it produces no vegetation. The name of this river, Ed, evokes the name of the Sumerian primordial cosmic river god, Id. And so, very much like the first creation story, this story uses the language and the shape of ancient mythology, but it demythologizes it. So this river is not a river god, as it is for the Sumerians, but nevertheless, the name is retained. Okay, so we get a description of what's not there. The world was not like it is. It was a desolate planet with water on it, more or less. Now we come to and God did something. So we're told Yahweh God formed the human ha-adam, out of the soil. So this is a very important conceptual statement for understanding this story. So first of all, the verb to form. Unlike the first creation story where God simply makes or creates humanity through a speech act, right? He says it is. In this story, humanity is formed from pre-existent matter as a potter molds clay. That's the image of forming here. So notice it focuses on process, not an instantaneous snapshot, right? Um, this also anticipates the possibility, which will be explored in later stories, that just as human beings are formed to be a certain way, they're designed to to actualize themselves in a certain way, they can also deform themselves. They can distort themselves, right? And there's even a wordplay here. So later on in chapter 6, verse 5, and chapter 8, 21, where it's talking about the problem of evil in the world, it'll say evil comes from the yetzer, the desire of the human heart. So notice there's a relationship between yetzer, which literally means formation, and wayetzer, which is the verb to form. Okay, so we are not created, we are formed. Okay, another note about the human. So although the word Adam has been used in the first creation story, there it's used as a species designation, as in the species Homo sapiens, as opposed to sea monsters or other living creatures, right? Here, however, the Adam is an individual, an archetype, as it were, right? But an individual, a prototype, an archetype of all other humans, but it is singular, right? Also, a note about the gender of the human. It is ha'adam, the word is grammatically masculine, but it is not yet marked as man, which is a different word in Hebrew, until Yahweh God interrupts his primordial singularity by constructing woman. So we'll talk about this shift in not just pronouns, but a shift in nomenclature, that the human is, in a sense, androgynous. But on the other hand, it's masculine. So, but it doesn't become marked as masculine until there is a feminine. So this story is also about the process by which gender comes into being. Remember, Genesis 1, male and female. This story, it's a process. Finally, the dust. Why are we made out of the dust of the soil? What's the significance of that? First of all, it's very clear that we are not godlike. There's nothing particularly godlike about dust, right? Instead, if you will, we are soil-like. You know, humanity is created with no particular divine characteristics. In fact, although this has not become part of the story yet, dust in the rest of the Bible often is a metaphor for death. So you can look at some of the passages I have here. So this is anticipating the fact that we are mortal, which is perhaps assumed by the first creation story, but not focused on. It's not made an issue. Here, mortality is a very important question. Okay, the next piece is also very important. So I have some background reading if you want to look at it. But we're told after God forms the human from the dust of the soil, God blew life's breath into the human's nostrils, and the human became a living being. So, well, we know that humans are living beings, we know animals are living beings, and so forth. This particular statement, when the Bible was translated into Greek and Latin later on, the word for nephesh, for living being, nefesh haya, it was translated as soul, which in the Greek is psyche, where we get the word psyche, psychology, and in the Latin is anima, where we get the word animation. But the Greek and Latin notion of the soul as something distinct from and separable from the body is not found here. So this is very important. There is nothing distinctively human about having breath, right? Any air-breathing living creature has breath. So again, the point of this story is that at our inception, we are we are simply living creatures. We are soil that breathes, more or less. Um, so in most of the Bible, in most of the Tanakh at least, uh, human beings are not a composite of body and soul. Rather, they are a psychosocial unity. that is powered by air. And when the air leaves, that unity dissolves, right? It dies, right? But in the passages in the library that talk about um, what happens when you die, there is nothing about the nephesh going somewhere and having some sort of identity. There is something about what's called a shade, which is not the same as your soul. That is simply a shadowy image of yourself that has no vitality to it and simply lives underground, but more or less doesn't even live really. So this is an important paradigm shift because even if you are neither Jewish nor Christian, even if you're not a religious person, you probably think about the word soul as some ethereal portion of the human person that can be that can survive and persist on its own outside whether there's a body or not. You know, maybe you don't think that, that's fine too. If you don't think that, your view is actually much closer to the Bible's view, right? But anyway, this is something important about how human beings are defined. We are we are we are matter that breathes, basically. Okay, after having created a human, you might expect God to create to bring about rain and have rainfall agriculture, but that's not what happens. Instead, God plants a garden. He plants a garden in a place called Eden, which is said to be in the east, not like east of where the person writing this is, but in the east as in where the sun rises, where the origin, as it were, of light and life come from, a kind of symbolic direction. Um, and we're told he places the human that he had formed in the garden. This too is a bit, it's logical but surprising. It's logical because gardens need gardeners, right? So the human being is created to be God's gardener. However, we know that something's missing because even if there's a gardener for the garden, there's no one to work the soil outside the garden, right? That lack, which we know is somehow going to be remedied because we live in a world that is populated by humans, uh, we're not told why God puts this person there. So here's some notes about differences. Unlike the first creation story, humanity in this story is not created to be fruitful and multiply, or to fill the earth and subdue it, or to rule animals. Because you can't fill the earth if you're confined to a garden, you can't multiply if you're alone, and you can't rule animals if no animals exist. Well, of course, this is a story about reality, so eventually it's going to talk about how people do fill the earth, how they do multiply, and how they can interact with animals. But none of this has happened. The point is that all of that is posterior after the primary definition of the human, which has nothing to do with any of those things. The human is a gardener. That's it. Okay, then we get this description of the garden itself. We're told that God caused to sprout from the soil every tree that is desirable to see and good for food, and the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, also understood in the middle of the garden. Okay, so we need to at least identify what these trees are. Later on in the story, we will discover that the tree of life, if one consumes its fruit, it imparts immortality, which is defined in chapter 3, verse 22 as a divine characteristic. So if humans ate from that tree, they would share immortality with the category of the divine. Also, later on in our library, in the book of Proverbs, for example, wisdom, the capacity to think, to know good and evil, is described as a tree of life. Okay, but that's a different usage of that. Okay, tree of life means immortality. Knowledge of good and evil means moral discernment. And to a more specific degree in this story, sexual awareness and capability. But moral discernment is the key thing here. Human beings have moral discernment, right? We have the capacity to judge and evaluate something as good or not good, right? That's something that differentiates us from animals because animals can only react by DNA programming or instinct. Human beings can actually make choices. But on the language of this story, that is impossible until you have knowledge of good and evil. Here are just many passages from other books of the Bible that illustrate this concept of knowledge of good and evil. Okay. There is then a long digression about the cosmic geography of the garden, in which you have four sort of rivers, branching out from it to the four different directions, representing the totality of the universe. There's a lot of details here, which you're welcome to look at. I'm just going to move forward here. Okay, so we get this resumptive statement. The Lord God, or sorry, Yahweh God, took the human and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and guard it. Here we have humanity's function, right? To work the garden and to guard it. Okay, well, we know what working a garden would be like, although we have to bear in mind this is not like a vegetable garden, a cottage garden. This is a royal pleasure garden. So it's more of, well, raking the leaves, things like that. But what would work actually mean in this context, since a river already irrigates it, right? That's already been established. That God has already caused things to sprout. There's a river. There's not a lot for the human to do, actually. And more importantly, from whom or what does this garden need to be guarded? There are no other humans. There are no animals. As far as we know, there are no other beings out there that could threaten the well-being of this garden. So it's a very odd job description. Remember, in the first creation story, human beings are created to subdue the earth and have dominion over animals. It's this sort of global mission, whatever that is. But here, it's to work and guard the garden. Okay, there's going to be a kind of twist here because in the end, the human is going to be expelled from the garden and the garden will be guarded against the human, right? But a curious purpose here anyway. All right, I'm going to pass over some of this here. Okay, then we have the first dialogue, the first language, the first words or discourse in here. Yahweh God commanded the human, from all the trees of the garden you may surely eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat from it, for on the day you eat from it, you shall die. Okay, this is mysterious on several levels. First of all, why does God want to ban human beings from becoming moral actors? Why does he want them not to know the difference between right and wrong? This is a curiosity, and this will be part of the dynamic of the story later on, is how human beings acquire this knowledge, ironically, by ignoring the command, right? It's also curious that God says, on the day that you eat from it, or when you eat from it, you will die. Because, in fact, when the humans do eat from it in the story, they do not die. In fact, in the final sort of decree of human destiny in chapter 3, verse 19, where God says, by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread until you return to the soil. So there you have this notion of mortality, although you don't die on that day. In fact, in this story, or at least in the following stories, the human, the archetypal human, ends up living 930 years. That's not really a short lifespan, right? So, in other words, there's all sorts of mysteries here that aren't explained. Why does God not want them to know? And why does he give them a death threat, which he will not carry out? Okay, now we get an important deliberative passage. Remember in the first creation story, God deliberated about creating humans, right? He didn't have any second thoughts about anything else, but he says, let us create human beings in our image, right? Here, God has a different thought. It says, it is not good for the human to be alone. I, God, will make a helper corresponding to him. Okay, well, we know that we're social beings. We're probably the most social animals that exist. So obviously this is describing that process, but why treat it as as an afterthought? In the first creation story, it's like that from the beginning. Why does God have to think about it? Oh, there's something missing here. Well, this is part of the portrayal of God that's very different in the second story. Here, he is not this sort of omniscient, cosmic, source of everything, who has a blueprint, as it were, in his mind and just sort of executes it without any deliberation for the most part. Here, this is an improvisational God. What we learn from this is that God knows good and evil, right? It is not good that. Okay, so this is an important statement that anticipates to know good and evil, to know the difference between something good and bad, is a divine characteristic, right? So it's not that this God is incompetent. Rather, when he discovers that there is a problem, he responds. He executes a solution. Okay, let me offer this one further thing. Of course, they said, yeah, we're social beings. According to the philosopher Aristotle, there are three kinds of goods human beings require to live well. We need bodily health. We need external things outside our body to feed our body, to sustain our body, like food, clothes, shelter, etc., money. But then there's a third characteristic, a third category of goods that we need, which he calls interpersonal goods. Or literally, he calls it goods of the soul, but we might say interpersonal goods. In other words, not just something internal to ourselves, not just something external to ourselves, but something that exists between ourselves and another person. Experiences of love and belonging, companionship, um, as well as, intellectual and aesthetic stimulation, all sorts of things that aren't simply an object out there or a subject in here. Intersubjective, interpersonal. Okay, that's what is being addressed here. Okay, uh, how does God respond? He forms animals. So again, it's not just that this is an afterthought, but actually the initial experiments don't work because he forms animals and brings them to the human to see what the human would call them. Whatever the human would call each living being, that was its name. Um, but jumping down to this verse, the human did not find a helper corresponding to him. So this is an interesting passage too, because it's directed towards this end of finding a helper for the human to enable the human to become interpersonal. But at the same time, it's this sort of sidelight. Oh, by the way, this is how animals got names. And this too is a distinction between the first and second creation stories. God calls things by their names. He gives them names in the first story, and he alone does that. But in this story, he invites human beings to participate in that process of naming, right? And so here we do notice that human beings are somehow differentiated from the rest of animals, not by their makeup. They're all made from the soil. They all have the breath of life breathed into them as living beings, it says here. But there's something about language, right? Language is something that makes us more than just animals, but it's not thematized here. It's just sort of introduced, right? Okay, so let's see. Um, what else do we want to say here? Okay, the experiment fails. Animals now exist, but they do not correspond to him. Um, okay, then God takes plan B, casts a trance over the human, and the human slept, and he took out of one of his ribs and closed the flesh behind it to construct, to build a helper. I want to make an observation about this word trance. Trances are rare events in biblical literature. They mark tectonic shifts in reality. So, in other words, if someone goes into a trance, something really important is going to happen. I mean, here it's kind of an anesthesia so that he doesn't feel pain when he pops the rib out. But you can look at other passages where you have these trances. The Greek translation of this is ecstasis, ecstasy, literally standing outside oneself. And that illustrates the fact that after the operation, the human in solitude is no longer fully himself. He only becomes fully himself interpersonally with others, right? Okay, so we have, again, an interesting verb here. Bana, Yahweh God built or constructed the rib that he had taken from the human into a woman. And he brought her to the woman just like he brought the animals to the woman. So here we have an interesting twist on the whole contemporary debate about is gender natural or constructed, is nurture or nature. Well, here it is created, but it is constructed by God. So you have this sense of, again, that gender is secondary to our humanity here, unlike the first creation story where it is primordial. Um, and this suggests that, I mean, what does this image of taking a part of the human out of the human and constructing it into another kind of human? It suggests um, that interpersonal reality that defines who we are, it can't just be based on physical kinship with other creatures, right? It has to be something that we see in another person some part of ourself, or perhaps through an interpersonal connection with another person, we discover part of ourselves that we didn't know was missing, right? Um, so this is, very profound when you think about it. It's a reflection on the interpersonal nature of being human. Then we have for the first time the human speaks, right? Um, and he speaks in this nice little poetic stanza. This time at last, he says, bone of my bones, flesh from my flesh, this one shall be named woman, for from man, notice the shift from human to man, she was taken. So here's where you have the introduction of gender-specific terms of ish, man, and isha, woman. This expression, bone and flesh, this is an idiom for kinship in other books of the Bible. There are some passages here. Also, what is interesting about this whole scene, unlike the first creation story where the sexual differentiation of humans, just as of animals, is procreation, to be fruitful and multiply, right? That's the conception of the first creation story, but there's nothing about procreation here. It is not an objective purpose. That sexuality has no objective purpose of perpetuating a species, yet instead it has a subjective meaning. It is the recognition of the self in the other, right? Okay. And to emphasize this, we have this comment in chapter 2, verse 24, not by God, not by the man, not by the woman, but by the narrator, by the person writing it, an observation. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his woman, and they become one flesh. So again, you have this sense of a primordial unity has been ruptured in order to create interpersonality. And then through this experience of physical union, presumably physical union is that's the cleaving part, although it would be emotional, ties as well. That leads to this renewal or restoration of a kind of differentiated unity, right? This is a reflection on human nature here. But again, there's nothing about procreation. It's just about interpersonal communion. Okay, last point from the setup of this story. This is all the build up to the main action. We're told the two of them were naked. First, we've heard about that, the human and his woman, and they felt no shame before each other. Here, by the way, is where you see how the human, although prior to this, the human is more or less androgynous. Nevertheless, here, human now marks maleness and woman marks femaleness. So there's a bit of sexual asymmetry, at least in the grammar, which is very typical of many cultures, right, including the one that produced the Bible. But the key point here is not that they're naked, but rather that they felt no shame. This is an extremely important concept, partly because in our culture, especially in our therapeutic culture, we've labeled shame a negative emotion that is destructive and should be avoided, right? Um, Now, certainly self-destructive emotions should be avoided, but this changes the meaning of the term shame in most human cultures. In most human cultures, shame means a sense of what is right and wrong, an instinctual sense, a conscience, as it were, right? So this is just a primordial illustration of the fact that they do not know good and evil. They are incapable of knowing it, right? Um, the other part about shame that's important is that it is an interpersonal emotion, right? Shame reflects how others will see you, right? Not like, there's some authentic you and there's this artificial imposition of culture or society on you, but rather we're interpersonal beings. We care about how others are impacted by us. That's shame. Okay, we shift now to the action. Genesis 3. The snake was more cunning than all the animals of the field that Yahweh God had made. Okay, we have a new character here who is going to be important for shaping what happens, for shaping the outcome of the story. It's important that we understand what this snake is. In later tradition, in both Judaism and Christianity, the snake becomes what I call Satanized. The snake becomes interpreted as either a mouthpiece for or a manifestation of some malevolent power, right? Satan, the devil, etc. And I have all sorts of passages here from Jewish and Christian literature that illustrate that shift, and you can read them if you want. But in this story, read on its own, the snake is not some demonic beast. The snake is simply one of the animals that God formed from the soil a few verses earlier, one of the animals that the human named snake a few verses earlier. It's an animal. Now, it's a special animal because it is more cunning. It has a characteristic that others don't. And this characteristic, cunning, which in Hebrew is arum, this alliterates and assonates. It has a word sound likeness to nakedness, arumim. So there's something about cunning and nakedness in this story that kind of come together here in what happens in the story. Not that nakedness is cunning, but rather um, the snake itself is kind of naked, isn't it? It doesn't have fur. The snake sloughs off its skin periodically, which might say it's kind of like taking your clothes off, right? So there might be some reason that this snake is the actor in the story, because the snake is also seen in the ancient Near East as a symbol of death and immortality. In the story of Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first piece of ancient literature, you have the hero Gilgamesh who's trying to gain immortality for himself. He gets a plant that will grant him immortality, but on his way back to civilization, bringing this plant, a snake eats it and becomes immortal instead. And so then humanity is doomed to be mortal. So there's definitely a cultural resonance of this snake in the Near Eastern kind of environment in which the Bible was developed. Okay, what does the word cunning mean? Well, in other books of the Bible, the wisdom literature, cunning can be either a positive, like a pragmatically positive thing, like it's the opposite of being stupid, or it can be a more devious thing, like the ability to manipulate and deceive. Um, it's important to recognize that the snake is not bad. The snake is cunning, which means the snake is an ambiguous character. Again, when you satanize the snake, you remove that ambiguity. You say, oh, the snake's evil, the snake's bad. But that's the later tradition. Okay, I'm not saying the later tradition is wrong or that it can't be read that way. We're just trying to appreciate the text as it is. The snake is very much what we would call in folklore a trickster character, right? Think of Prometheus in the Greek tradition, or Coyote in Native American lore, or Anansi in West African culture. A trickster is a character whose cunning has both positive and negative effects. This is important for our analysis of this. It has a hybrid nature. For example, the snake is a talking animal. Animals don't generally talk. And the snake also possesses divine knowledge, which at this point neither animals nor humans possess. So the snake is both animal, sort of human-like, and sort of also divine-like. It crosses these boundaries, right? And it's significant that it is through this boundary crossing snake that human beings will cross the boundary from being mere animals to people who know good and evil. Okay, um, a few further comments about, sort of resisting this tendency to read this story through the lens of later tradition where the snake is bad. Um, Not only is the snake not portrayed as evil or rebellious, the story does not claim to be about sin, which is usually how this story is read, that the human beings sin by eating of this fruit they're not supposed to, and the snake's the one who encourages them to do this. Um, Now, it might be sin if you want to define it that way, but that's not what the story is about, right? It's about how humans become human by acquiring moral discernment and how God prevents them from becoming gods by denying them immortality. That's what's going to happen in the story. Finally, the text does not conceptualize this change as a fall, right? People will say, this is the story of the fall. That is not how the story portrays it. Because, first of all, there's nothing for them to fall from in this story. They've just been created out of dirt. Rather, it leads to gains as well as losses. Okay, so yeah, there are going to be negative consequences for the humans from the perspective of being in a garden, but there'll also be positive consequences. So, for example, as a result of the expulsion of the human from the garden, the earth will get a human to work the soil. If he's in the garden, the earth has no worker. Secondly, humans acquire the capacity for true free will, because true free will presupposes the ability to discern between good and bad, good and better, bad and worse, and that kind of thing. So that's a good thing, right? It's what makes us human. Now, that be having that free will doesn't mean we'll use it in the right way. So it's not that we're all perfect or anything like that, but we wouldn't even have the ability to be good, as it were, without this knowledge. And finally, expulsion from the garden enables humanity to fulfill its function as described in the first creation story. This may be one way of thinking about the relationship between these two. In a sense, the second story impedes the fulfillment of the first creation story. But because of what happens in the garden, people are finally enabled to fulfill their destiny according to Genesis 1. Now, I'm not saying that that's how we're supposed to read it, but that's one effect of putting them side by side. You can reflect on their differences and how they pan out. Okay, the snake has a conversation with the woman, and the form of this conversation is important because it is a psychological investigation, really. Um, it shows how language can shape the way we view things. So it begins by the snake asking a question of the woman. Did God really say, do not eat from all the trees of the garden? Well, notice that the snake has used the words of God's statement in chapter 2, verse 16, from all the trees of the garden. But instead of God saying, do not eat from them, God said, you may surely eat from all of them. So notice the snake has flipped the valence of something that God said. Now, it's kind of interesting that both the snake and the woman, neither of whom existed at the time when God issued that command, somehow know about it, right? Maybe the man told them, who knows? But in any case, he's asking a question. What did God say? And here, and notice here too, this is an important difference. Notice that here, when they're in conversation, they don't say, what did Yahweh God say? They say, what did God say? So the divine name disappears here, probably because it is a way of emphasizing the theme here is that human beings will become like Elohim. And so we call God Elohim just by itself. We're talking about the category of the divine now and the category of the human. Okay, the woman answers rather thoroughly, although she adds some stuff in about we shouldn't even touch that one because we're going to die if we do. The snake continues, you shall not die. Indeed, God knows that on that day that you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will become like gods, knowing good and evil. So already we realize that the snake asked a disingenuous question. He knew the answer, and he knew more about it too, as he's now revealing. So the snake is really guiding a conversation here to get something to happen, right? And interestingly, again, what the snake says is absolutely true. Their eyes will be opened, they will become like gods, and they will know good and evil, and they will not die, on that day at least, right? So the snake does not lie. Okay, then we have the key turning point in the story. The woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes. Notice both of those expressions come from the last chapter where it said God created all the trees to be good for food and delight to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. So she took from the fruit and ate it, and she also gave it to her man beside her, and he ate. Okay, so this wisdom piece, it's desirable to make one wise. Well, again, think back to Aristotle. Aristotle says we need bodily goods, that's food. We need aesthetic pleasure, right? If we lived in an ugly world, that would not be pleasant to live in. We like it's good to see beauty. And wisdom. Wisdom is one of the most important things we can have, according to Aristotle. It is what is called one of the virtues, to be wise, to be able to discern between good and evil, and so forth. So the woman has her eyes set, as it were, on three real goods: food, beauty, and wisdom. All these are intrinsically good things. But she doesn't quite understand what wisdom is because, unlike food and beauty, which can be satisfied instantaneously by eating or looking, you can't magically become wise, right? Wise wisdom is a virtue. It's something, it's a habit that a person must cultivate intentionally in order to be able to live well. If there's anything that is quote unquote deceptive about the snake's conversation is that he's tricking her into thinking that wisdom can simply be, obtained in this easy way. Well, partly true because you need to have the ability to develop wisdom. If you don't have the ability, you can't develop it. But how would she even know this? She knows that she wants wisdom, right? Okay, so we're told immediately the eyes of the two of them were open. They knew they were naked. Okay, so there's again that notion of nakedness and knowing the difference between right and wrong, or what's appropriate, what's shameful, and what's appropriate. So their first reaction is to cover themselves with fig leaves. Then we're told they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking about in the garden in the evening breeze. He's the king walking through his pleasure garden, which reminds us that, oh, he's the landlord and we've just violated the tenancy policy. We're in trouble, right? So the human and his woman hid themselves from Yahweh God in the midst of the trees of the garden, which is also ironic because they're hiding exactly where the tree is that they weren't supposed to eat from. Um, there's a lot of irony going on in here. I'm going to skip over that and focus on what the fallout of this. If you don't want to call this a fall, you can call it the fallout, right? So God finds out that a fruit that hasn't that they violated the tenancy policy. He interrogates them and judges them. And the result of this judgment will be that human beings become like we now experience being human. Okay, let's see how that is. So he finds out that the human has, in fact, realized that he is naked and therefore that he knows good and evil. Um, does he ask this question, where are you? Because he doesn't know, or does he know? And he's just getting the human being to fess up. What is really interesting is how complicated the human's answers are to him. And God says, where are you? The human just could have said, here I am. But instead he said, I heard your sound in the garden and I was afraid for I am naked, so I hid. Okay, who told you? Well, the woman. Um, who you gave to be with me. This she gave to me from the tree and I ate. Notice he's shifting blame to her here. This is the sign of a guilty conscience, right? He's not just answering simply, he's kind of massaging what happened, right? Um, the woman is interrogated. She says, oh, the snake deceived me. Okay, so there, blame the snake. And then we have interestingly, God does not interrogate the snake, right? He doesn't give the snake a chance to defend itself. Instead, he judges the snake, right? Because you have done this, cursed are you out of all the domestic animals and all the wild animals in the field. Notice how this kind of reverses the superlative nature of the snake. It was more cunning than all the other animals. Now it's cursed out of all the other animals. You shall crawl on your belly. Apparently, the snake walked on all fours before this and eat dust all the days of your life. So again, the snake is mortal and it must eat what is the symbol of death. I will set hatred between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. They will strike at your head, and you will strike at their heels. This is an explanation for why snakes bite people when they step on them. Um, okay, moving through along here, we now get judgments cast upon the woman and the man. Let me go back to this little chart here. Notice that this is all arranged in a kind of mirroring image. The man is interrogated, the woman is interrogated, the snake is judged, the woman is judged, the man is judged. Man interrogated, man judged, woman interrogated, woman judged, and the snake is judged right in the middle. Okay. Okay, what does God say to the woman? He says, I will greatly multiply your labor pains from pregnancy. In pain you shall bear children. You shall desire your man, and he shall rule over you. Okay, so notice that God inflicts pain upon the woman, and the pain has to do with an element that has not been part of the story, childbirth. Now, why does God mention childbirth at this point? Well, it's anticipating the reality that we are mortal, right? And that if we do not reproduce, the species will become extinct. So suddenly, childbearing becomes part of the picture, as it was not in the garden. This second part about you, your desire shall be for your man, and he shall rule over you. So here we have an explanation of why you have sexual asymmetry, of gender hierarchy in certainly in the ancient world. Um, I have a historical note about this actually, which I just want to quickly run by. What is being described here, among other things, is some of the consequences of a shift from a hunter-gatherer existence, which is what we were for most of our 200,000 year history as modern, anatomically modern humans, and a sedentary lifestyle based on plant domestication, agriculture. Because, and then I'm drawing this narrative from archaeological and osteological remains, which, so for about 10,000 years ago is when people begin to settle down and domesticate plants and animals. Once you start to farm, you need to have a lot more children to keep the farm going. You need to have a lot more people to do the labor in order to sustain the growing population. So it's sort of this exponentially growing thing. If you're hunter-gatherers, you don't want lots of children because children, especially infants, will slow the band down as it moves, right? So this idea of um, suddenly the woman is going to experience pain in childbirth, and a lot of it reflects the fact that as this transition, this sociological transition happened around 10,000 BC, women became more and more sedentary. They became more and more tied to a domestic sphere. And because arable land became a kind of commodity, and that was often associated with marriage, controlling women by men became an imperative, at least in their own mind. So, in a sense, this is imaging an actual change that happened in human history. And obviously, it's trying to justify it too, at least to explain it, right? But what I want to focus on is this theme of pain. So there's a word play here. The words for pain here are itzavon and etzev, pain, which sounds like the term eitz for tree. So again, the punishment for the crime. You ate from the tree, I'll inflict eitzev on you, right? Desiring the man recalls desiring the fruit, but now it is redirected from aesthetic and philosophical pleasure to sexual desire. Being ruled by the man reverses the independence and initiative the woman demonstrated in the garden, right? She was the one who initiated the conversation with the snake. She chose the fruit, and the man passively accepted it. So, in a sense, she ruled him there. Now it's going to be reversed. Okay, the man gets the longest judgment here. Since you listened to your woman's voice and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, do not eat from it, cursed is the soil because of you. In painful labor, notice it's the same pain here, you shall eat from the soil all the days of your life. In other words, you will have to work the soil now, just like the story began, there was no work soil, now there is. And it will be unlike working the garden where you don't have to do any work. It will be hard work. It will be painful labor. So both the woman and the man receive at least a consequence. I don't even know if you can say this is a punishment. It's simply the consequence of what's going to follow because they don't really realize what's going to happen. They're going to be expelled from the garden. If they're outside the garden, you need to work for a living. You need to actually make food. Otherwise, you will die of starvation and you need to reproduce. Otherwise, your species will become extinct because you'll be mortal. Okay, so there we have the description of what happens. As we said, the punishment fits the crime for the woman. Here, the punishment fits the person. Right? God formed the Adam out of the Adamah, the soil. By cursing the soil, the Adam will now be forced to work it, right? And to work it painfully. His laid back working of the garden will be replaced by cultivation of a resistant ecosystem. And instead of carrying out this threat of instantaneous death, the deity inflicts painful and perpetual labor all the days of your life, rather like he inflicts upon the snake. Okay, now, interestingly, we actually get a name given to the woman, not a category name like Isha, but a personal name. The man, the human, remains anonymous in this story. Later on in chapter 5, the human Adam will become a personal name, Adam. But here we get the name Eve or Hawa, for she was the mother of life. Notice this, the human who names her as a result of the change of their situation, right? And life giver is actually a positive thing, right? Um, so again, the outcome of the story is both positive and negative. It's a mixed bag, right? Thistles and thorns and roses, right? It all goes together here. Um, God makes leather garments for them, still not telling them what's going to happen. But, again, this is anticipating, outside in the desolate earth, you're going to need some more sturdier clothing than simply fig leaves, right? So we have that. And that suggests that the deity's punishment is also balanced by care here. Okay, now we get the all-important verse. This is the most important verse for understanding what this story is about. God talks. He says, "Behold, the human has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Who is he talking to? Maybe another divine council. Actually, we do hear in the next couple verses about other divine beings. So he's talking to other beings who are like him. The human has become like one of us. I did not create this human like me. I did not create them in my image and likeness. They have become that through this action. And notice the emphasis. It's not, behold, the human has sinned, or behold, the human has done something wrong. Well, yeah, in God's view, it's sinful, but the point is that they have become godlike. Now, says God, lest he reach out his hand and take from the other tree and live forever. And then instead of completing the sentence, God expels them from the garden. It's a wonderfully dramatic statement. Um, and what does it tell us, right? We can infer now some motives on God's part. So God does not want human beings to be gods. They've already become part godlike through their knowledge. He doesn't want them to get the other part, right? At least not in this now, and that's ironic because in the later Jewish and Christian tradition, um, either immortality or more prevalently resurrection of the dead, some reversal of the condition of mortality will be envisioned, but not here. So God doesn't want human beings to be gods. And in order to prevent them from being gods, notice he can't just say, "You're not gods." It's not speech act like, I will make them, not divine. That's what the God in the first creation story would have said. Instead, we have to keep them from eating from that other tree. So the expulsion from the garden is really a protective action to prevent them from being gods. Right? Um, so we learn from here that the category of being divine is to know good and evil and to be immortal. Human beings are part way, but not the whole way, right? And so there we have coming out with a similar kind of conclusion about human nature as in the first story where we're made in the image of God, but here we have become this. Okay, a couple other interesting questions. Why was God not concerned about them becoming immortal if they ate from that other tree? Now, it didn't say that you couldn't eat from the other tree. It said, don't eat from this tree. So there's this interesting reflection on how knowledge and immortality relate together. But in any case, we can't have our cake and eat it too in this story. So we have to, we're banished, we're told. And then it says, God stationed east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the flame of the whirling sword to guard the path to the tree of life. Again, human was made to guard the garden. Now the garden is guarded against him. What is a keruv? These are hybrid creatures that guard entrances to sacred places in the ancient Near East. They are not naked babies as we have in later Western art. A keruv is a giant griffin, basically, don't come near. We're not sure what the flame of a whirling sword is. It may be a deity, it may be a weapon, but in any case, we get the idea. They can't go there anymore, right? Um, so, some closing reflections. How do we read these stories together? As I said, they're narratively incompatible. You can't blend them together without destroying them. But they're obviously intended to be read together. Each offers a distinctive view of God and a distinctive view of human nature. They are both true in the view of the editor who put these together. They both speak a truth, right? Is light a particle or is it a wave? Well, the answer is yes, it's both, right? Are human beings like they are portrayed in Genesis 1? Are they portrayed in Genesis 2 to 3? The answer is yes, right? They are both ways of thinking about this. So here's some ways that we might consider the impact of these two stories. They force us to think in terms of both and instead of either or. So, for example, humanity can be described both statically, the snapshot that we get in Genesis 1, or dynamically as a process of becoming, of evolution, as it were, right? Secondly, God can be described as both transcendent, beyond his own creation in Genesis 1, or immanent inside his own creation, as it is in the second creation story, where he forms the human, he plants the garden, he puts the human in the garden, he walks through the garden, and all that. These are two ways of thinking about God. Or, along the same lines, is God omniscient in Genesis 1, or is he improvisational in Genesis 2 to 3? And then finally, maybe this is the most potent way in which these stories trigger us to think creatively. What is seen as a blessing in the first creation story, subduing the earth, being fruitful, multiplying, is seen as a curse in this story. There's good and bad. There's positive and negative, pros and cons to every aspect of human existence. And because we are able to distinguish good from evil, we can know the difference between them. So that's one way of thinking about that. Okay, so I hope this has been helpful. And again, hopefully next week we will get the live stream up and running. But hope you had a good you have enjoy reading the handout. Take care.